Haven't you guys ever seen a dragon before?
What's up guys, my name is the Kiwi Dragon and I'm back again with a brand new Crash Bandicoot video, but not one you're probably expecting. Instead of talking about CTR Nitro Fuel today, I'm going to be talking about the future of Crash Bandicoot in terms of the mainline series. In particular, how I would write the next Crash Bandicoot game. I've always wanted to try my hand at writing something for an established property, be it a TV show or a movie or a video game. But I've never actually sat down and truly had a go at writing out my own vision for a story. So today I decided I would outline my vision for a future Crash game. A game which I would call Crash Bandicoot: The End of Time. I hope you'll all enjoy my vision for a new Crash game, as this has been something I've been tinkering around with for a good while now. So it's been widely speculated and heavily rumoured that we're getting a new Crash Bandicoot game in the near future. People have speculated that it's supposed to be coming this year, although it's uncertain how accurate that will be given the current global situation. Hopefully we'll find out rather soon about the future of Crash Bandicoot, especially as there will be a live stream in a couple of days which will reveal the PlayStation 5, and it's speculated we'll see Crash there. But anyway, let's move on to my pitch. Next year is 2021, which will not only hopefully be a better year than 2020, but on the 9th of September of 2021 will be the 25th anniversary of the release of the first Crash Bandicoot game on PlayStation 1, which will be a huge milestone for the franchise. Personally, I think that if a new Crash game gets released in late 2020 or early 2021, I'd be extremely doubtful of another game being released at or around the actual date of Crash's 25th anniversary. And so personally, I thought that the next game should be a celebration of everything Crash, a love letter to the franchise in the same vein that CTR Nitro Fuel was a love letter to the fans of Crash Team Racing and Crash Nitro Kart, whilst the Insane trilogy was a beloved remaster of the original trilogy to celebrate the then 20th anniversary of Crash Bandicoot. So with the idea of celebrating 25 years of Crash in mind, I set about deciding on a few aspects of the story for the game. If you use Reddit, you may have seen me asking about the idea of bringing back characters who were only in one or two games, so they can come back as part of the story of a new game, even as bosses. One of the other things I asked about on Reddit was whether or not people wanted to see a soft reboot of the series which would take place after Crash Warped, or if people wanted the next game to follow on, not directly after, but some period of time after Crash Mind Over Mutant. The poll I put up showed that people really wanted a soft reboot of the series, but I could also see that people were very vocal in the comments section about wanting to continue the series without retconning everything after Warped. So when it came time to finalise my idea for a new Crash game, I personally decided that I didn't want to make the huge decision of whether or not to go for a soft reboot or to make this the 8th game chronologically. So I decided instead to set the timeline for this new game as being the 4th Crash Bandicoot game, chronologically between Warped and the Wrath of Cortex. I made this decision for a specific reason. Obviously this could be a soft reboot of the series which would follow on from the Insane trilogy, and the series would continue on from this point with new games. Or alternatively, it could just slot in between Warped and Wrath of Cortex if the decision was made to not soft reboot the series, as Wrath of Cortex does not follow on directly from Warped, meaning there is a gap where another game could be retroactively inserted as the chronological 4th Crash Bandicoot game. I know there are fans out there who love the 4 mainline games after Warped. The Wrath of Cortex, which I've seen a lot of love for lately, Twinsanity, which has always had a very passionate following and deservedly so, and then there's Titans and Mind Over Mutant, which, while I won't pretend to like, I know there are fans of both of those games. So while I see the logic of a soft reboot, I don't necessarily want to do away with those games or their fans. It's just that they wouldn't be integral to this game's plot, like the original trilogy would be. Now that I've got all the preliminary details out of the way, you're probably wondering what exactly the plot of this game would be. So without further ado, let's move on to the story. First of all, like I said before, this game would be set between Warped and the Wrath of Cortex. If you remember the last cutscene from Crash Warped, you will remember that the 3 villains, Cortex, Uka Uka and Entropy, were transported back in time to the prehistoric era, with Cortex and Entropy being reduced to infants, and there was seemingly no explanation why we jumped from seeing them in this state in Warped to seeing them back to normal at the first cutscene of the Wrath of Cortex. I would use this ending cutscene from Warped as the basis for the early part of the plot. We'd see early on that Uka Uka would be able to reverse the effects suffered by Cortex and Entropy by casting an incantation using some dark magic to revert Cortex and Tropy back to normal. Entropy would then teleport the trio out of the prehistoric era and back to their relative time. A few weeks later, they would then meet at Cortex's secret laboratory to determine the next villainous scheme. And at this meeting you'd have Cortex, Engine, Tiny, Dingodile and Entropy. But in addition to the 5 bosses from Crash Warped, they'd be joined by another 2 villains. I wanted to utilise 2 villains who didn't receive much love as the franchise progressed. Those 2 villains being Ripperoo and Pinstripe. The 5 bosses from Warped would remain relatively unchanged, whilst Ripperoo's Jekyll and Hyde-like personalities would become even more apparent. In his more civilised state of mind he'd be able to speak coherently, but would still be prone to bouts of madness. While Pinstripe would be relatively unchanged from his original appearance in the first Crash Bandicoot game, he would have just fallen on hard times and would be working for Cortex again to make some money. At this meeting, Uka Uka would be infuriated as he has started to become extremely tired of the failings of Cortex's schemes and wants them to destroy Crash, Coco and Aku Aku once and for all. It would be at this point that both Cortex and Entropy would reveal that they have their own schemes to defeat Crash and his allies. Cortex reveals that he has a new version of the Cortex Vortex, which is fitted with what he describes as a device capable of firing a beam at the Earth to knock it off its axis, causing harsh conditions and potentially leading to natural disasters which would devastate the planet. Unless of course its citizens would bow down to Cortex as their almighty ruler. He suggests that the power crystals would be the key to powering this device. He describes the results of knocking the planet off its axis, which would be intense heat waves which would cause the polar ice caps to melt, which would flood the Earth, allowing for massive tidal waves. All the while the planet would be devastated by massive earthquakes beyond anything on the Richter scale, and horrendous gale-force winds and storms which would batter the planet on a daily basis. Cortex's plan seemingly is coming together and all the villains seem to be in agreement, except there's one slight problem. Entropy is unwilling to cooperate with the plans of Cortex, as he thinks Cortex's plan is doomed to fail. The other villains remind Entropy that he was brought in by Uka Uka and not them, and if it was their choice, they wouldn't be working with him. Tropy reminds them that without the time twister which he designed, their last scheme seen in Warp would never have come to fruition. At this point he would tell them that he could come up with something bigger and better than Cortex's plan. The villains decide to go along with Cortex's latest scheme, with Tiny, Dingodile, Engine and Ripperoo all standing unanimously with Cortex, while Pinstripe sort of reluctantly agrees, purely out of loyalty to Cortex, but he seems to be concerned about the plan. With all the villains siding with Cortex except for Tropy, Uka Uka declares that they shall advance with Cortex's scheme. Tropy is unhappy with this and leaves, vowing to recruit his own team, and tells Uka Uka that he will succeed where Cortex has failed time and time again. Entropy would then be shown at his own base, happy at the prospect of not being surrounded by Cortex's idiots. He realises he can have his revenge against Cortex and his minions as well as Crash at the exact same time. So Tropy travels back to the boss fight from Crash 3 Warped. With the help of his younger self, he defeats Crash before time splinters and fragments, creating an entirely new timeline where Crash Bandicoot no longer exists. Meanwhile, in the present day, Aku Aku has sensed a disturbance in time. He begins seeing premonitions of some dystopian future where the Earth has been ravaged and destroyed and conquered by the villains. The villains have seemingly split into 2 factions, which are warring with each other. In a world where Crash and Coco no longer exist, while Uka Uka is nowhere to be seen, Aku Aku, sensing a great danger, would then transport Crash and Coco to the unfinished VR hub, which Coco has been working on and would later be seen in Wrath of Cortex. Aku Aku casts an incantation to freeze the VR hub inside an instance of time, before Tropy travel back to change the past, allowing it to exist outside of the devastations of the timeline caused by Entropy, meaning Crash and Coco would not disappear from time entirely. Aku Aku would inform Crash and Coco that he cannot reverse the effects of time on a magnitude such as this with his magic alone, and he will need the power of 40 power crystals, as well as the clear and coloured gems and the relics, as well as Coco's knowledge of the technology in the VR hub to reverse the effects of Tropy meddling with time. From here the heroes would set off to undo the damage to the timeline. Crash and Coco would find themselves going through several levels from Crash's past in the first 3 games. including jungle levels, underwater levels, space levels, castle levels, futuristic city levels, ancient pyramid levels, Arabian city levels, icy land levels, and sewer levels, among others. The game would also introduce new environments including harsh deserts, erupting volcanoes, gigantic worn-down oil rigs, and disused circuses. Vehicle levels would also return, including the motorcycle and jet ski levels, as well as polar and para riding stages. However, all of the returning levels would be different to how they originally appeared. For example, the jungle levels would be on fire due to volcanoes constantly erupting, as well as the intense heat waves. Aquatic levels would also have radioactive waste to avoid, as nuclear power stations would have been damaged or destroyed in the planet's devastation, causing mutations of the creatures in those levels. The space levels would see the player navigating destroyed space stations with bits of destroyed satellites and other spacecraft in the distance. The castle levels of the past would remain relatively unchanged, only with trophies insignia adorned on the castles and on some of the lab assistants dressed as knights who would be dueling other knights who would be representing Cortex. Futuristic cities would be on fire and in ruins with broken windows, juddering platforms, and rusted robotic minions to defeat. Ancient pyramids would be crumbling to pieces with horrifying creatures emerging from the sarcophaguses, including lab assistants who would have somehow become cat-like, and some sort of strange plant matter managing to grow inside of the pyramids. The Arabian cities would also be in ruins, with a constant harsh sandstorm blowing which has eroded the environment. Icy environments would have begun to melt, with bits of ice of various shapes and sizes breaking off and floating away in the cold sea. And the sewer levels would be full of skeletal remains, with horrifying sludge monsters and rats mutated by nuclear radiation inhabiting them. Naturally, when you've completed all the levels in the hub world, you'd go on to a boss battle. Of course, boss battles are a staple of the Crash games and would return, as would the Time Twister messages, which would see each boss have their own opportunity to say something menacing to our heroes. Some complaints I've seen over the years about bosses in Crash Bandicoot games is that there are too few of them, that they are too easy, and that not enough boss battles leads to a lack of variety for different characters to have a chance of appearing. I hope to rectify this by having a total of 8 boss battles. In these boss battles, you will sometimes face off against either 1, 2, or even 3 enemies. And much like in the Wrath of Cortex, the boss battles would get names much like the levels. While I've only given rough ideas of the levels, I have outlined the boss battles as well. And I'll go through those, starting with boss battle number 1, Sharpshooter. The boss battle would take place on top of a fast-moving train in a modern city environment. The boss battle would play similar to Cortex's final boss battle in the original Crash game, where Cortex face crashed from the side of his Cortex blimp. In this scenario, Pinstripe is in a helicopter flown by lab assistants, and would be wielding his Tommy gun. You would need to move out of the way that Pinstripe is firing, avoiding the blast of ammo from the Tommy gun. As per usual, soon enough his Tommy gun would jam, with the helicopter just in reach for Crash to jump up and spin into Pinstripe before he starts firing again. You'd need to hit Pinstripe 3 times in order to beat him. Pinstripe would then land on the ground, only for some of his old Mafia cronies to arrive and surround him, as the screen cuts to black, leaving Pinstripe's fate ambiguous. The second boss battle would be Twisted and Tangled. This boss fight would be the first one featuring 2 bosses, and would take place inside of a giant greenhouse in the shape of a pyramid, and would introduce 2 of Entropy's new associates. Their names would be Entombed and Entangled. If you've ever heard of the cancelled game Cortex Chaos, these 2 names will be familiar, as these would have been characters that would have been introduced in that game. My vision for Entombed would be an immortal scientist who had been able to stay alive due to forbidden ancient Egyptian magic. However, thousands of years after pharaohs ruled over Egypt, the magic began to wear off. He heard of a plant that could extend his life and turned to a world-renowned botanist, Dr. Entangled, who invented a life elixir using the plant that could keep Entombed alive for thousands of years to come. Entombed would use a stone armour that is powered by a dark power crystal embedded in his chest. He uses a magical staff to perform dark magic and control the cat-like lab assistants which he was responsible for creating, as those lab assistants are cat mutants created by a splicing machine. Meanwhile, we have the aforementioned Dr. Entangled. Like Engine, Embryo and Cortex, he was a graduate of the Academy of Evil. Since he was a child, he was fascinated by plant life, and he developed a venom that made him able to control plant life. He made his secret lab in the desert, as the plant used in Entombed's life elixir was only able to grow in dry conditions. He modified his base into a gigantic glasshouse shaped like a pyramid after he assisted Entombed, as the duo began working together before being employed by Entropy. This odd couple would fight Crash at the exact same time. Entangled would try to crush Crash by growing trees and large spiky plants from the inside of his body. Entombed would send his cat-like lab assistant minions to attack Crash, before then using his staff to cast dark magic on the bandages on his hands to shape them into gigantic fists to try and attack Crash with them. Occasionally, the duo would then work together, trying to double team Crash by using bandages and vines as ropes and whips in an attempt to hold Crash and attack him. You would need to spin the vines and bandages back at the duo to twist and tangle them. Do this 3 times and you'd defeat them. A cutscene would then play with Crash and Aku Aku asking for further details on Tropy's plot from the duo. Neither of them would respond, so Crash and Aku Aku would just leave, leaving the pair tied up as the gigantic glasshouse pyramid collapses, leaving it unclear whether or not Tombed and Tangled survived. Now onto the third boss, which would be Mechanical Madness. Crash would have to face a gigantic battle-damaged mech piloted by Engine, which is devastating a futuristic city. This would be a battle similar to their encounter in Crash 2 Cortex Strikes Back, where Crash had a small platform to stand on in space. Only this time, it's a rooftop of a damaged high-rise building. Crash would need to avoid the weaponry, including a gigantic circular saw on one hand and a rocket launcher on the other, before attacking the weak spots of the mech when the power drains. You'd need to destroy the 3 weak spots of the mech, including the saw arm, the rocket launch arm, and the power source in the chest generating energy beams to destroy the mech and send Engine packing. After this, a cutscene would play with Engine maniacally laughing that Cortex has already succeeded. The planet is already off its axis and no one will stop Cortex, not even Entropy. This is all before Engine runs away. The fourth boss fight would be the frightening Funhouse. Once again, a new villain would surface in this boss battle, another character from the cancelled Cortex Chaos game, Dr. Entertain. Entertain also studied at the Academy of Evil, but he was kicked out from the Academy for his low grades. He decided to use his knowledge of science to make a travelling freak show. In his youth, he enjoyed dressing up as a clown and scaring Cortex, knowing full well that he has a fear and deep hatred of clowns. His weapon is a musical box attached to a cane. Crash would have to face Entertain inside of a torn down funhouse. You'd chase him through the disused circus and past all the broken down amusement rides until you go inside of a tent. There, Tertain would face you inside of a room full of mirrors, using his music box to attract some of the freaks he's created to fall from the rafters to attack Crash. Later in the boss fight, he would play a different tune from his music box to attack you with crazed alternate versions of Crash, which would be popping out of the mirrors to attack you. You would need to spin them back at Entertain to weaken him. He would also send a deafening blast from his music box to attack before using it to launch himself at Crash, attempting to land and hit him with his hands, which had been fitted with deadly joy buzzers. You would need to spin the crazed Crash minions back at him 3 times. On the 3rd time, he'll become trapped inside of a big mirror behind him. At this point, a cutscene would play where Tertain reveals that Tropy knows Crash escaped being wiped from the previous timeline, and that Tertain was merely a distraction. He refuses to say any more than that, and he laughs maniacally, only for the mirror he was in to then shatter. Boss number 5 would be Brains and Brawn. Crash would arrive in a rusted cage similar to a UFC-style octagon, which is suspended above the ground in a sewer where you'd encounter Tiny. Before the boss battle begins, you'd see Embryo, who advises he'll take it from here and drink some of his serum. You'd start off by avoiding Embryo, who would transform into his more monstrous form. However, the serum would wear off and Tiny would appear, kicking Embryo towards you for you to attack him. Each time, Brio would drink a new version of the serum, making him bigger and bigger, while you're avoiding his pounding fists. Tiny would also be trying to crush you as well, so you'd need to avoid them both at all costs. After 3 hits on Embryo, a cutscene would play where Embryo would drink a serum that would make him gigantic. Tiny would then look up at Brio, getting envious of this gigantic size. Crash would suddenly realise what's about to happen and back away towards the edge of the cage. Crash would climb out of the cage and onto the support rafter, just as the floor of the cage gives way beneath Tiny and Embryo. The duo would then fall down to ground level, where Embryo would crush Tiny before reverting back to his normal form. This boss battle would carry on Embryo's story nicely, as he became an anti-hero in a way in Cortex Strikes Back by working with Crash to defeat Cortex, even if it was more of a way for Brio to get revenge on Cortex. Of course, we've seen Brio and Tropy ally with each other in Twinsanity, so it would make total sense to make the duo work together here in this new game. The next boss is the 6th boss, Volcanic Panic. This boss battle will be a fusion of Ripperoo's boss battles from Crash 1 and 2 inside of a volcano. The player would need to get Ripperoo to chase after them as he bounces along on his walking cane, placing TNTs and nitros behind him as he goes. Dingodile will be working with Ripperoo and be standing on a cliff firing blasts from his flamethrower. You need to get Ripperoo to walk into the path of the blast, and he will jump up in pain, hysterically laughing, landing next to Dingodile and smacking him into the lava with his cane. You'd need to do this 3 times, and Roo would smack Dingo into the lava one last time. A cutscene would then play which would see an incredibly angry Dingodile jumping out of the lava in pain, priming his flamethrower only to notice that the volcano is about to erupt, and to see Ripperoo retreating with Dingodile chasing after him through another exit of the volcano, only for rocks to come tumbling down after they make their exit. The 7th boss would be Sensory Shutdown. In this boss fight you would face Entrance inside of a television studio, which he has been using to mass brainwash the planet's remaining population in order to use them as Tropy's henchmen. Entrance would then attempt to squash you and attack you similar to how he attacks in the Entranced Game Boy game. However, unlike the Entranced Game Boy game, he has gained the ability to make the player see illusions through the power of hypnotic suggestion. In these illusions, the player would be attacked by weaker versions of past Crash Bandicoot boss characters, including an illusion of Papu Papu, who would send some tribesmen to attack the player, then try to smack the player with his staff. Koala Kong, who would throw bits of the equipment from this television studio at you, and then you'd have to spin it back at him. The Komodo Bros, who would attack you similar to how they do in Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back. And finally, Oxide, who would try and run you over with his hovercraft before activating a laser stored within it. You'd need to avoid the laser beam and hit Oxide to break the illusion. Generating and holding the hypnotic state, which would cause Crash to see the illusions for periods of time, would make Entrance weaker, so all you would need to do is defeat the illusions one at a time and then hit Entrance once to defeat him. I know there are mixed feelings about Entrance as a character, but I felt like bringing him into the story would make sense. When he appears in Crash Bandicoot 2 Entrance for the Game Boy Advance, it is established that he is already good friends with Entropy. However, whilst this is the game that properly introduces Entrance, it is entirely possible that Crash could have faced him before, as there is no dialogue in that game to suggest that this is the first time that Entrance had met the good guys. Entrance is a perfect candidate for a boss for this game, as he has worked with Entropy before and is already established as being good friends with him. Plus, he only appears in one boss fight in the entire series, so he's a character that could be utilised for more boss fights in new games. And finally, the 8th and final boss fight, Scientist Skirmish. You'd face Entropy in his secret laboratory, where he would reveal that Uka Uka had been playing the two sides against each other so he could side with the winning faction. At this point, Cortex would suddenly appear on his hoverboard and would be trying to shoot Entropy with his blaster, with Tropy using the staff to deflect the blasts back at Crash. Whilst this is all going on, Aku Aku and Uka Uka would be dueling, similar to how they did in Crash Warped. Each time that Entropy would be hit, the stage would transform into different environments, going from his secret lab to the Cortex blimp above Insanity Island from the final battle in Crash 1, then aboard the Cortex Vortex in space from Crash 2, and then Cortex's room from the final battle in Warped, and the final stage would be platforms above the Time Vortex itself. the player would need to avoid the deflected blasts from Cortex's ray gun and Tropy's time blasts and hit Tropy a total of 5 times. On the 5th time, he will be sent flying into the vortex below, with him losing grip of his staff, which goes flying upwards towards Cortex, knocking him off the hoverboard and into the time vortex below as well. The non-100% ending would see Crash and Coco back at the unfinished VR hub, with Aku Aku having a vision of the future, with the world still in ruins. Aku Aku informs them that the time cannot fully heal without the help of every single one of the coloured and cleared gems and every relic. The 100% ending would see Tropy and Cortex fall into the vortex. Uka Uka would save Cortex at the very last second before teleporting away. Aku Aku would then transport the player away from the fracturing time vortex and back to a stable timeline, while a familiar hand rises out of the time vortex before that timeline turns to black, ceasing to exist. At this point, we would see the villains meeting once again, similar to how they did at the beginning of the game, only this time without Entropy or Pinstripe present, and none of Entropy's minions are present there either. Uka Uka advises that Cortex and his minions had better come up with a brand new scheme to defeat the Bandicoots and conquer Earth without fracturing time and reality itself, or they'll all suffer. At this point, you'd see the Bandicoots at the beach relaxing with Aku Aku, Pura and Polar as the credits roll. Then there would be a post-credit scene where Tropy awakes in some strange looking world which he deduces to be some kind of hallucination. In reality, it's some kind of alternate world. He doesn't like it and deduces that this world shouldn't exist before teleporting away to try and find his way home. This post-credit scene I made to be a nice little nod to the much beloved Twinsanity game and would be referring to the 10th dimension. And if this game was retroactively inserted as the 4th story chronologically, this would just be a nice little nod to a game that would happen later in the series. But if the developers were to take the option of doing a soft reboot, this could potentially set up a sequel, allowing for a reworking of the plot of Crash Twinsanity. It'd be entirely up to the next bunch of developers and writers at that point. And that'd be my vision for how I'd write the next Crash game. I'm sorry this video got so long, but I had so many ideas I wanted to share, and even if the Crash game ends up looking nothing like this, I'm okay with that. I'm honestly happy to see Crash back and to see him in a brand new game. As long as there's no mention of mutants or titans in the title, I'll be good. I'd like to take this opportunity to give a quick shout out to the user HappyMarsky on DeviantArt, who kindly allowed me to use his artwork of Entombed, Entangled and Entertained, as his designs more or less fit with the ideas that I had for the characters when I first conceived the idea of bringing them into the story. You can check out HappyMarsky's DeviantArt page using the link I've provided in the description below. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts about the story and other ideas in the comments below. If you didn't like it, tell me what you'd change and I'll let you know my thoughts about that. I've been the Kiwi Dragon, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye for now.